Hello, Michael here from Small Robot Studio with another Maya and Unreal Engine tutorial. Today we're going to be having a look at how to take an animation from Maya and render it in Unreal Engine. And this is going to be a beginner's step-by-step guide. So if you're already a little bit experienced with Unreal, I will be covering some stuff that you possibly already know. I'll try and make sure there's chapters in the video so you can skip forward and back as you need. So we're starting from the dead start here. Before we jump into Maya to get the animation out, we're actually going to start a project in Unreal first because I want to create some directories in which we're going to export to. So we are in the Epic Launcher. At this point, I would assume that you've managed to install Unreal Engine. And if you haven't done that, I'll link a tutorial in the description that's been covered quite extensively. So we're going to launch Unreal 5.0, and you can do this in 4.27 and higher. But I want to use the Lumen rendering engine, so we are going to be using 5.0. So we're going to create a film and video, and we're just going to start with a blank scene, and we'll also rename this project. I'm going to call it tutorial, and I'm putting it in my Unreal Projects directory. So this will create a tutorial directory, and project defaults will also enable real-time ray tracing, and this assumes that you have hardware that can support that. So we will create that, and what you'll get is a scene that looks like this. And the first thing you'll notice is if you try to pan around that all your controls are backwards if you're used to Maya, and this is the first thing that I will always change. We'll go to Editor Preferences, and we will up the top here type invert, so we can find invert middle mouse pan. So we'll select that. So now when we alt middle mouse click and alt left click, it's the exact same as Maya. There's your right click as well. And we're also going to start from a completely blank canvas here. So there's a bunch of stuff here. This is sort of like your outliner here. This is all the actors in the scene. And we're going to select all of them. So it's just shift select all of them there, and we'll delete them. And yes to all. So now we've got a completely blank scene with nothing in it. And that's going to work nicely for us. So we need to save this scene. So we'll save it, and it's actually saving current level. And under the content, this is going to be the directory that we use within our project, which I'll show you here. So that's the root level of our project, and in the content directory, this is where we're going to be putting everything. So you can pop your map in here if you like. We will call this tutorial underscore animation. Save. And you'll see that that is now visible there in Windows Explorer. So now we're ready to go into Maya and bring across this animation. Okay, so here in Maya, you'll see I've got a animation here, which is actually quite old from a few years ago from a compositing tutorial that we did here. But we're not going to be doing the compositing aspects in Unreal. We're just going to be grabbing the geometry animation, so the animation of our character. And this method will work with any rig whatsoever, though once you have exported this animation, you cannot update it in Unreal after this point. We're not sending across a rigged mesh, we're just sending across the animation data of an animated mesh. There is a thing called LiveLink for Unreal and Maya, and that's not fully integrated at the moment. It's still a work in progress. However, it's also worth noting that it won't work with every single rig that's ever existed, and it doesn't work with this rig, and it actually doesn't work with any of the rigs that I've got. So that's only going to work with certain rigging workflows. So if you've got a rig that's already been created, or you created a rig yourself, this workflow is going to work nicely. Just make sure you have your animation locked down before you do the export. So what we will be doing is we'll be creating an Alembic cache from our geometry and bringing it into Unreal. And we'll also reassign all the materials in Unreal, so you get a little bit of understanding about that material workflow in Unreal. And I will just find all my geometry here. So these are all the geometry pieces. So to get our Catmull-Clark subdivisions, or a approximation of, rather than using a normal map, which we could do on a low poly mesh, we're actually just going to export the higher subdivision. Now, this will be a restriction depending on your computer and the size of the rig that you're working with. When I subdivide this rig, it's only 150,000 polys. So a roughly lowish rig this will work fine for. This is probably higher than it needs to be, so should be fine if you've got something similar. So we are going to select the mesh. We're going to go to smooth with the option box, and we will go to 2 levels and smooth, and that's fine. and then we'll just make sure that we reselect that. So now, yes, 144,000, and this will work fine. So what we now need to do is create an Alembic cache. So under the modeling toolkit, we can go to cache, Alembic cache, and this should be enabled by default, but if it's not, you can always just go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and Plugin Manager, and just ensure that ABC import and export are loaded. So cache, Alembic cache, and we're going to export selection to Alembic. Now, so make sure you are only selecting the geometry that you want to export. Do not select blend shapes and things like that. So just the geometry that you want to be visible. So we're going to select the time range, so how many frames, and this is going to be 160 frames. I'm just going to use the time slider, which will give me that 160 frames. We'll also scroll down to the bottom here. We'll make sure we have UV right and right face sets selected. And then we'll click Export Selection. Then we'll go to our Unreal project. And under the content directory, we're going to create a new folder. And we'll call this folder Maya Import. You can call it whatever you want. And then we need to give this a name. We're going to call this guy tongue face underscore anim. That is his name. And then we'll click Export. With that now exported, if we jump back into Unreal, you will see a change to the source content has been detected. Would you like to import it? We will import it. So that's our Alembic file, and you'll see it's got a bunch of different things here. Those are all the individual pieces of the mesh. So with this particular character, a couple of eyes, the tongue, the teeth, and the horns. And we want to change the Alembic import type. We're going to change this to skeletal. This does not mean it's going to have any rigging controls. It's just the version that works the best. The other option is geometry cache, but this does make it a little bit more difficult to set up the materials if you do it this way. So I'm preferring skeletal at the moment. That may change. With the geometry cache, I will just point out there is the option to, if we do the drop down here, you can calculate motion vectors. Now, with the skeletal mesh, we still will be able to get motion blur, so that's not a problem for us. Now, we can create the materials on import. We're not going to do that. We're just going to import it as is. Now, just bear in mind that may take a minute or so to import, depending on your system and the size of the file. So just be a little bit patient. Just let the computer do its thing. So on the left here, our content browser will show everything that we have in our project directory, and you'll see the My Import folder there. And this will expose the Alembics that we have just created. We've got these 3 nodes here, which we don't really care about any of them except for this middle one here, which is the one with the animation on it. We need to put them on something, so we need to create a bit of geometry here. So we'll go to create, and we'll just create a plane, and we can scale that up using the same hotkeys as Maya. So that would be R to scale. And there's no lights in the scene currently, so we'll just create a simple light. So create lights, and we'll use a rectangle light. And this light works the same as a lot of the lights that I've taught you guys to work with in the past. However, you'll notice that with the gizmo, that when I'm rotating, it's actually rotating on the world axis. That's not a lot of use for us, so we just want to press this button right here. It's going to give us our local rotation, so that will make it a little bit easier to rotate. On the right here has got our options for setting the light intensity and all that. We won't do that just yet. We'll actually just create a quick material to begin with for this floor so we can actually see it. So we'll go back to the content directory, and we'll right click here, and then we can create a new folder, and we're going to call this folder materials, and we'll just dive in there, right click, and we'll create our first material. And this is just going to be called floor underscore mat, and we'll double click on that. And when you do so, it brings up the blueprint editor, which is essentially the same as your Hypershade editor in Maya, though the navigation is slightly different in the sense that it is right click to pan around. So we're just going to set a base color to this material, essentially a diffuse material, and to do so we need a vector input. So we'll just type in vector, hit tab, type in vector, and we'll get this vector node, which essentially will give us our RGB output. So we'll take this top pipe it into our base color, and if you miss by any chance, you can just Alt and left click on it to delete it. Then we'll just select the node under the default value, click the left side, and we'll just give this a grayscale value of something like 0.8. Hit OK. Now, if we left click and drag this onto the floor geometry, you'll see that it applies the material, but it's also applied it with this default normal map and possible default color. And that's because anytime that you make a change to this inside the blueprint, we need to click apply to update it. You can also save your materials as you work on them. That will save them in case of a crash, and it's always good to save your work as you're working in case you do end up crashing it. So now we have a floor here, we've got a light. Let's bring in our animated geometry. So we'll go to Maya import and we will just left click and drag him into the scene. So at the moment he's tiny. We can just select the right hand side here. I'm going to make him quite a bit larger. If we click this lock icon, it will constrain all the proportions. So we could set something like 32, which is about the right size, maybe 30. And you'll notice he's down on his face at the moment. He does fall over, but this is not the default position he should be in. So we'll select this and we just need to rotate this along. Now I've currently got it snapped, so we can snap to the 90 degrees. You can do that with the snapping icon there. Now the character is floating at the moment. He is actually floating in the first frame. When we have him animating, you'll see him land on the floor and that will be fine. We do want him to also run away from the camera, so we're going to have him sort of run away from the light on about that angle, and we can move him into place like so. So that's the initial setup for him. He currently doesn't have any materials on him. Actually, we'll just rotate him around so we can see him a little bit easier when we add these materials. So we've already created one material. We're going to create a couple more. Jump into the material editor, and if we select our mesh, our animated geometry, we can scroll down here on the attribute editor, and you'll see we've got all these material inputs, and these will be all the different pieces of the geometry. So we just need to reassign all of our materials, and we're just going to generate those one by one. So we can right click and create a material, and the material is going to be called tf_body_matte. And for this one, this is his body material. We're going to use the texture map that I already have. So what I'm going to do is create a textures directory. So we'll just go up to the content directory, right click there, new folder, call this textures. And what I've done here in Windows Explorer is just imported all the textures that I needed, which I've done in a test run. So a lot of them have been already converted to Unreal Engine packages. So if we jump into the textures folder here, you'll see them all there with some terrible UVs from a few years ago. We'll go back to our materials and we'll start assigning these. So to call these textures into this project, they do need to be in this project directory. You can only search within the project. You should have those good project directory habits from using Maya correctly all these years. So that's going to be fine for you and I. So here is our tongue face body material. We're going to grab a tab texture sample, and we will just go to the texture, and there's a drop down here, and we'll just type in body. And that's going to give the body diffuse map that I've already created, and we'll run that into the base color. Now remember, we want to click apply, and we'll minimize that. So we're going to click and drag this body mat. Instead of directly onto our mesh, we're going to drag it onto one of these elements, and I believe the top one will be our body. Let's find out. So this is all good. However, on my other rendered versions, I actually have a mask that I set up so I can have a different amount of specularity inside the mouth as to the outside of the body. So to set that up, we'll jump back into this material, and I'm going to use that mask. So we're going to create another texture sample and run that result RGB into roughness, and then we'll just go to the search option here and we'll type mask. And I've got the mouth mask that I already created. So something I did notice, and this will depend on where you export your textures from, is that I had to invert this mask for this to work correctly in this rendering engine. It was the opposite way around. And to have some specularity, the other thing we'll need to do is define the specularity input, and we need to do that by creating a constant, so just a value. So hit tab and type constant, and we're going to run the constant into the specular, and then we'll give it a value of, say, 0.25. Okay, so with our specularity set, we just want to click apply again, and we can close that for now. And if we zoom into the mouth here and a bit more of an angle, you can see that the inside of the mouth has got that specularity where the outside and the rest of the body does not. So very similar to what you would have already experienced in Maya. and very similar to setup. So if you've got pre-existing maps, very easy to work with. So I'm going to generate the materials for the remainder of the rig, and just like I did, so you don't need to see me do that. So there they are, and all that remains is to assign them to the remaining pieces of the mesh. So the problem is here is that we don't know which is which. So it's just going to be a bit of a guessing game, and we're just going to slide the bone on there. That one's correct because that's gone into the horns. Is the next one going to be the teeth? It is. Okay, so we got those correct. Then the next one's probably going to be the eyes. It is not. It is the tongue. So there's the tongue, and then the last two will be the eyes, like so. So pretty straightforward stuff. So you can see, even rendering in real time, that's looking quite nice. We're not getting too much global illumination on the backside, particularly while the camera re-exposes itself. But for this style of animation, this is going to look really good and render very quickly. So we'll save that, and now we're going to create a render camera. So we're just going to go up to Create and to Cinematic and Cine Camera Actor. And this is just a camera. And we can move this into place, and what you can see here is if we actually click this little pin icon, it will pin the camera to the bottom right hand side of the screen, so we can actually compose the shot as we would like. And we can set up all the depth of field and things like that, which we'll get to in a moment, but for now this is pretty much fine. The final thing is to actually get this to animate, and this is the slightly more confusing thing coming from Maya, where everything is just on one singular timeline. Everything has its animation assigned to it, and you can sort of edit it inside of one browser, essentially, is how it works in Unreal. So what we need to do is we need to add a level sequence under cinematics. So cinematics, add level sequence, and we're going to create a new folder again. This is going to be called sequences. And this level sequence is going to be called tongue face render. Save that, and it will bring up the sequencer on the bottom there. It may be floating for you, like so. I prefer to have it docked down the bottom here, so just click and drag the tab into there. And we're going to do a couple of things here. First things first, frame rate 24 frames a second. It's not a video game, this is going to be an animation, so we do want to use industry standard frame rates. Next thing, we need to put some animation on this timeline, because at the moment there is no animation. So we'll start by putting the camera on there. So left click and drag the camera on there, and you'll see it comes up, and that's all good. Still no animation. That's because we need to put our animated actor in there as well. So we'll grab the tongue face animation from the outliner there, and we'll just slide it in underneath where the camera was. And so this still won't have animation on it because that track there doesn't actually have the animation activated. There's a track button which you'll click, and you'll go to animation, and you'll see that sequence there. And then you can have it start from whichever frame you want. So at the moment it's starting on frame 9. It's just going to capture that animation. We're going to make it start on frame 1. We're actually starting from frame 0, however, and the reason we're going to start at 1 frame later is just so when we render it, the motion blur acts a little bit more nominally. Now this is a 160 frame sequence, and at the moment we've only got 120 in, so we're going to extend the sequence settings to 160, and we'll just go to 160. We'll right click there and set end time, and now that is going to be exactly right. So our camera, we might just move him over a little bit, and we'll have him run in and then bop into the side a little bit more so we can see what he hits. So it's going to run in, hit that, and then wobble around for a little bit and pop out. We'll also need to make sure that we extend this camera cut here to the full length as well, so we get to frame 160. Now this is particularly useful if we're doing camera moves and things like that. The other good thing about having the sequencer here is that we can click this button here next to the camera, and it'll lock us into the actual camera point of view, which is quite useful. And if you want to undo that, you just click it again. And we'll probably put some geometry in here for him to run into. So just find the frame where he hits the wall, which is going to be that one right there, and we'll just put in a bit of a cube. All right, lovely. So there's a nice black shiny wall for him to run into there. And we might just stick another light in as well. We could actually do this just by selecting the existing light and holding Alt and dragging, and it will just duplicate the light. And I don't want to spend too much time lighting this. This is just sort of something pretty basic to get us started. So we will select this light here. We'll do some real simple things like temperature. So under the right hand side here, we can scroll down and we will select use temperature. And I'm going to select the temperature, maybe 6,000. We'll just warm it up a little bit. And then this one above here, we're just going to reduce the value of that to say 4. So we've got a bit of a darker side. And you know what? I'm actually going to rotate him around to run to the other side of the scene. So you should be noticing that the great thing about all this is that being able to update all this geometry with the lighting in real time is that we can actually do quite a bit in terms of look dev without having to go backwards and forwards on IPRs or test shots or whatever. You can see what the camera looks like. We can make the changes that we want. Now, is it as good as a offline render? No, it is not. It is getting there, and I would say within the next couple of years it's going to be pretty impressive what you're able to do, particularly as the hardware catches up. So we've got a nice little scene happening here. It's probably a little bit bright, but that's fine. The last thing I do want to do is just show you how to do some depth of field. We'll just find the spot where he is lying on the ground here, and we will select the camera actor, and under focus settings, you do want to make sure that you've got manual focus distance set to focus manual, and just use the picker, and we'll pick him there. So he's in focus now, and as he's nearer the camera, we'll probably get him out of focus. All right, so to get him out of focus, because of the focus distance that I'm working with here, I'm going to have to use a really stupidly unrealistic f-stop of 0.1 if I really want to show you what he looks like out of focus. The problem with that would be that it's probably too narrow depth of field, so we'll just change that to say 0.5 and just ensure that we get him in focus there. So he is slightly out of focus there, and then he'll be in focus once he's on the ground, and that's what we want. We can also set up a material for this black cube here so it looks maybe slightly less monolithic. Okay, great. So our animation is all set up. We've got the timeline set up. We've got a bit of depth of field. There is going to be motion blur, but currently that's not visible. And we are rendering with Lumen. Now Lumen is the default. You can change it to other things if you want to. We can just select the camera actor and we can scroll down to global illumination. Method will be Lumen. If you wanted to try some of the other ones, you may do that. Screen space kind of looks okay. Lumen generally looks the best. The other one you may want to look at, but I'm not going to be covering here, is if you go to path tracing, you can see what a path trace version will look like. It actually doesn't look incredibly different from Lumen, to be honest. The shadows are a little bit better, but for this sort of thing, this is totally fine. So let's render this out. A couple of render settings that we need to go over. First, we'll go to Window, Cinematics, and Movie Render Queue. And this is where we set up all of our different render jobs. If you've got different sequences, you could render them all at once, which makes it quite handy if you were doing a bunch of shots in one scene. So we're going to click the render plus icon, and we're going to select the sequence that we already created, which is called tongueface_render. And then we need to set some settings up here. So under settings, we're going to click this unsaved config, and we're going to select the JPEG sequence and delete that. I'm going to hit plus, and we're just going to do a PNG sequence here. Then we're going to go to plus again, and we're going to add in anti-aliasing, which will just give us some better edges. And we'll also add our console variables. And console variables are just some overrides that we can create. You can think of these as options that you would have in the Maya render settings. They are not surfaced by default because there are quite a few of them. I imagine they will start to surface more of the default ones as they progress with moving Unreal further into cinematic. The other thing to note is we can save these presets. So once you've done this once, you can save it and you can just keep reusing it. So I'm going to use some settings that I've seen from a couple of different tutorials, and they're pretty straightforward. So spatial sample count, I'm going to set to 2. Temporal sample count, I'm going to set to 16. I'm going to override anti-aliasing and make sure that's set to none. Now we're going to go to our console variables and we're going to add in a couple of variables. The first one is going to be r.motion_blur_quality. And this is just an override to increase the quality of the motion blur, and we'll just set this to 4. And then we'll click the plus icon again, and we're going to create another one, r.motion_blur_separable, and we'll set that to 1. And finally, we're going to select output, and we're going to select our output directory. Now, I'd recommend that you don't put your outputs into the project directory of the scene and the Unreal project that you're working with, because every time you do, you'll load all those textures into the project, and you don't really want to be doing that. So I'm going to go above that tutorial directory to a folder that I already created called renders. And I'm going to select the tongue phrase tutorial directory and select that folder, and make sure you want to check your output resolution is correct, 1920 by 1080, so full HD. So now that we're happy with that, we're going to go to presets. We're going to save preset as, and I'm just going to save this under my sequences, and I'm going to call this render basic. Save. We'll accept that. So now anytime that we want to use that preset, we can just click this drop down box and use render basic, and they'll be the exact same settings. Just double check that you aren't using the incorrect file path, so you may need to go in and change that output directory when you do future ones. Now there are two options for rendering. There's render remote and render local. Render remote is for rendering to a farm. Render local is for your local machine. So that's what we're going to do here. And what will happen when I click render local, it will bring up a low quality preview of our render, and it will slowly go through there. So you can see it's ticking off the frames rather quickly, even while I am recording. Okay, so that is now finished. That was about 2 minutes for those 160 frames, which is quite nice. So we'll have a look at that now. So I'm just going to open up that image sequence in Photoshop. So just open, and we'll find that image sequence. Just make sure you select image sequence and open. Select your frame rate, which will be 24. And you can see this first frame here is messed up, so that's why we want to make sure we crop it out, and there we go. Now unfortunately with this particular render, because of the position of the light, with this deformation that I have on the mesh, it's actually causing some pretty bad reflections on the eye. You probably won't have this problem because you're not using a specific deformer on a piece of geometry that doesn't really want to deform like that in Maya, but that is just something to be aware of that can happen if you're using deformers. Also, I didn't quite get focus right, it doesn't look like, because his eyes aren't in focus, but his belly is. So just pay a little bit more attention to that in future. But you can see that worked quite nicely. And the motion blur, you can see those individual frames. They do interpolate quite nicely, and they are fairly smooth, as you can see, and actually very, very clean, which is one of the hardest things to get right in offline renderers, is that motion blur can get pretty grainy. So if I did want to export that, I can just go to File, Export, and render the video as whatever video file I want to call it. And render it to whatever directory, that's fine. So that's all there is to it. That is the basic workflow for rendering any animation from Maya, essentially, and assigning the materials and getting everything set up from scratch. I'm going to continue to cover a lot of Unreal stuff in the future, so if you're interested in the more cinematic aspects of Unreal, that's what I will be looking at. So make sure you're subscribed, and if you found the tutorial useful, make sure you click like as well. It does help the channel out a lot. Give us a little comment, ring the bell, do all that lovely stuff. Alright, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time. That's it for this tutorial. If you found it useful, make sure you leave a like so other people can find it. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, as we're bringing out CG and illustration tutorials every week, just like this one. Become a patron and access tutorial assets, bonus content, a private Discord, and more by clicking the link below.